Good day. July and August are traditional months and weeks for military exercises, and we are seeing a flurry of them taking place in various parts of the world, but principally and specifically on that giant landmass which the Russians are increasingly referring to as Eurasia, and which of course encompass the territories that we call Europe, and which now form politically the bloc known as the European Union, but also the great landmass, the Central Asian landmass, Russia, and indeed China. Now, some of these exercises are normal for this type of year, and they would attract little attention. Some of them are purely courtesy affairs. There is, for example, a naval exercise going on in the Baltic Sea between the Russian Navy and the Indian Navy. Now, India and Russia have very good relations. They're very friendly countries to each other. India is a major buyer of Russian arms, and the two countries have conducted exercises together in the past, but they are and cannot in any sense be considered strategic allies, even though the most recent Russian defense paper, the Strategic Defense Doctrine, which the Russians published a short time ago, speaks of India as a country which, along with China, is favored by Russia and with which Russia intends to pursue close relations, even a strategic partnership. But as I said, India and Russia are not allies. The exercises that are taking place in the Baltic Sea are relatively small scale. I gather only one Indian ship, a frigate, is involved, and in no case could these exercises be seen as a threat or a challenge to anyone. However, other exercises are different. There's an exercise which NATO is carrying out in the Caucasus, in Georgia, which the Russians are already concerned about and have been flagging up as being an exercise which is taking place close to their southern borders, and which they are eyeing very carefully because it looks like an attempt to establish a NATO bridgehead in the Caucasus, which is, of course, from a Russian point of view, a deeply concerning matter. Then, of course, there was that huge NATO exercise in the Black Sea a few weeks ago, which I discussed in another video, which was essentially an attempt to establish a NATO presence in the Black Sea. Again, the Russians monitored it very carefully. They deployed large numbers of ships to the Black Sea to keep an eye on it. They sent their aircraft flying to keep track on what the NATO warships were doing. And by the way, they conducted naval exercises of their own at the same time in the Black Sea with their own fleet. Then there are another series of exercises which are unrelated to the duel between the great powers, and those are a good example of those are the drills that the Russian military is engaging in Central Asia, where the Russians at the moment have been busy sending troops and special commandos to Uzbekistan, 1,500 of them, in fact, and where there will be drills going on from the 30th of July to the 10th of August, alongside the Uzbek army, in order to secure, or at least to train to secure, the Uzbek-Afghan frontier. And there are also exercises going on in southern Tajikistan along the Afghan border, and there are reports that the Russians have been redeploying aircraft from their military base in neighboring Kyrgyzia to Tajikistan in order to reinforce their troops in Tajikistan in connection with the operations that are taking place along the Afghan border. And those operations, incidentally, are clearly intended, at least in part, as a show of force. both to the Taliban, reminding the Taliban of Russia's military power to the north, and therefore making it clear to the Taliban that if the Taliban were to have any ideas of trying to extend its influence or the influence of jihadi Islam into Central Asia, that the Russians are in a position to respond militarily to what they would see as a challenge. And also, of course, it is a show of force intended to impress the Central Asian states, to reassure Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzia that Russia stands with them and is there and is prepared to protect them. I would add that the drills, the exercises in Uzbekistan are particularly interesting and important because Uzbekistan is not so far a full member of the Eurasian Economic Community or of Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization. This is the military alliance that brings together various former Soviet states and which is led by Russia. Uzbekistan has up to fairly recently, stood aside from these arrangements, but it seems to be gradually integrating itself with them and seems to be open to the idea eventually of joining both of these organizations. So in a sense, sending troops to Uzbekistan in this way highlights the way that Russian power, military and political, is being extended into a key Central Asian country, Uzbekistan, which has at times seemed as if it might be prepared to slip away from Russian influence. So we have those sort of exercises going on. But I think the exercise which is going to interest intelligence analysts around the world most, and which is receiving the greatest amount of attention in both the Chinese and the Russian media, is a major exercise that the Chinese and the Russians are going to be conducting on Chinese territory in northern China, involving a deployment of forces from both the Russian and the Chinese militaries. And the Chinese have been careful to point out that this is the first such exercise taking place on Chinese territory since the start of the pandemic. And given how concerned the Chinese have been to ensure that there is no spillage of the infection from neighbouring countries, the extent to which the Chinese have wanted to seal their borders, that is an interesting sign, and it is an interesting indication that they are prepared to conduct such an exercise with the Russian army, given that Russia at the moment is struggling to deal with the pandemic and is struggling also to carry out inoculations across its entire population. I expect and presume that the Russian troops who will be engaged in this exercise will be carefully inoculated, and the Chinese have been given assurances about this. Anyway, the Russian comments about this troop deployment are very brief, but there is an extensive Chinese commentary, and it appears in Global Times, and it is perhaps a very interesting one. And I will read it because, again, the article is fairly short. And just to repeat again, Global Times is a Chinese English language newspaper and website. It is published by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of China, of the Central Committee of China's Communist Party. So Global Times, in effect, is China's way of communicating its ideas and thoughts to the world in English, and it is able to do so in a rather more forthright fashion than the more formal and official organs of the Chinese media, like the Xinhua News Agency, are able to do. And here is the Global Times article, and it reads as follows. Russia to join military drill in China, displays mutual trust, eyes Central Asia security. Russia is set to join a military exercise in northwest China with the theme of jointly safeguarding regional security and stability in August. It will be the first joint drill to be held in China since the pandemic outbreak in 2020, displaying a high level of mutual trust between the two militaries, whilst also eyeing security and stability as the US irresponsibly withdraws troops from Afghanistan. The Zapad Interaction 2021 exercise will be held in the Xingtongxia Joint Tactical Training Base in northwest China's Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region from early to mid-August, with the theme of jointly safeguarding regional security and stability. Senior Colonel Wu Qian, a spokesperson for China's Ministry of National Defense, announced at a regular press conference on Thursday. It is the first time that China will host a joint drill with another country since the pandemic outbreak in 2020, and the first time the name Zapad Interaction will be used for an exercise. The two sides will set up joint headquarters as the Chinese People's Liberation Army Western Theater Command and Russia's Eastern Military District will dispatch more than 10,000 personnel, multiple types of aircraft, artillery pieces and armoured equipment in exercises to test joint reconnaissance, early warning, electronic information attack and strike capabilities. Judging from the participating troops, related equipment and exercise subjects, the Zapad Interaction 2021 is a large-scale strategic drill featuring some of the world's most advanced weapons and equipment, as well as tactics. It could become a frequent series of drills. Since 2018, China has participated in the Vostok 2018, Centre 2019 and Kavkaz 2020 strategic drills in Russia. This will also be the first time that China will host a strategic drill that will see a foreign military invited, and the first time Russian forces will enter the Xingtongxia military base. The purpose of the exercise is to consolidate the comprehensive strategic partnership in a new era between China and Russia, deepen the pragmatic cooperation and traditional friendship between the two militaries, and further display the determination and ability of both sides to combat terrorist forces and maintain regional peace and security. China and Russia are maintaining regular annual exercises despite the difficulties posed by the pandemic, and this has reflected the necessity to boost the two militaries' joint capabilities to deal with regional and global challenges amid special situations. War could happen despite a pandemic, or a pandemic could happen during a war. A Chinese expert on international affairs told Global Times on Thursday, requesting anonymity. The drill indicates a new level of military-to-military cooperation, as well as a high level of political mutual trust. On Wednesday, Chinese State Councillor and Defense Minister Wei Fenghe held talks with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, as they attended the Defense Ministers' meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states. Both Wei and Shoigu mentioned the changing situations in Afghanistan and Central Asia, as well as the importance of safeguarding regional security and stability. The exercise also takes the changing situation in Afghanistan into consideration, the Chinese international affairs expert said, noting that the US's irresponsible troop withdrawal from Afghanistan has left a burden for neighbouring countries. As major powers, China and Russia need to play their roles, jointly safeguard regional peace and stability, and prevent the deployment of terrorist forces in the region. From a global point of view, both China and Russia are facing suppression by the United States, which led to the two countries' enhancement in military cooperation through joint exercises. Although the US is leaving Afghanistan, the presence of the US military will still be there, as well as in Central and South Asia. So China and Russia need to prepare to jointly defend their strategic corridors. Shoigu is invited to participate in the joint exercise, according to Russian media reports. This will be Shoigu's first time to visit China for a military exercise. And since we are on the topic of Shoigu, and before I discuss that article by Global Times, I should say that Shoigu himself has been making certain comments about what China and Russia need to do. Shoigu is, let me repeat again, Russia's defense minister, one of the most influential and powerful people in Russia, as well as somebody, by the way, who is also highly popular in Russia, where he is widely admired as an extremely effective and capable minister. And he's also known to be particularly close to President Putin. Anyway, Shoigu has been speaking, and in fact, he spoke at the defense chiefs meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe, which was the meeting that Global Times referred to, and TASS, which is the official Russian news agency, has quoted some of the things that Shoigu had to say, and they read as follows. In the current conditions, the importance of practical interaction between the defense ministries of member states, that's to say, member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the creation of effective tools of common security in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, responsibility area has grown considerably. Firstly, developing mechanisms within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to exchange information in the sphere of military security and experience in the war on terror, and also maintaining regular contacts between the general staffs. And then Shoigu is also reported to have said that 5 years ago, an expert working group under the auspices of the defense ministries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was set up. And quoting again, it is necessary to continue fine-tuning this cooperation mechanism to give it practical substance, displaying more initiative in drawing up a list of issues examined by experts. And he then went on to say, expanding the geography of military cooperation measures and strengthening their information coverage. He then said that the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization should look to improving troop training and peace mission joint counter-terrorism drills that should focus on practicing the methods of countering new tactical techniques used by international terrorists. In particular, this relates to the issue of fighting unmanned aerial vehicles, providing information security, and preventing terror attacks with the use of chemical and biological weapons. Thirdly, raising the level of SCO interaction on the issues of security with third countries and international organizations. This requires working on the possibility of acceptable forms of jointly engaging anti-crisis potentials of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It is important to expand the format of participation in SCO drills by engaging military contingents and observers of friendly countries and regional organizations, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The appropriate legal framework should be worked out if necessary. And Shoigu then went on to say that he hoped that the results of today's meeting and the implementation of the proposals that were voiced would lay a solid foundation for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's further consistent development and maintaining common stability and security. So these are extremely interesting comments, and let's just go back to the Global Times article first and note that this is a very large drill involving 10,000 troops, that it appears to cover a very wide spectrum of military equipment, including electronic warfare, aircraft, ground forces, communications equipment, reconnaissance equipment. Note also that the defense ministers of the two countries, China and Russia, will be observers and perhaps participants in the exercise. Notice also that there is to be a joint headquarters established, and also note that this is the first such exercise to be taking place in China. There have been exercises previously between the Chinese and Russian ground forces of an analogous nature taking place in Russia, but now there will also be exercises, regular exercises of this sort taking place in China too. And this comes shortly after a joint naval exercise in the Northern Pacific by the Chinese and Russian navies. Now, this is partly intended, this exercise is partly intended to contain the spillage or possible spillage from the war in Afghanistan, where the United States is pulling out, and the Chinese have made it very clear in that Global Times article that there is an eye also towards containing any spread of violent jihadism from Afghanistan into Central Asia and to Chinese territories. And of course that corresponds also and aligns this exercise to some extent with the exercises that the Russian military is having in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which I discussed at the outset of this program. But perhaps the most interesting takeaway from this exercise is the way in which Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, appears to be broaching the possibility that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization should develop a more overt military character. And the proposal that he made to the defense ministers of the countries that make up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, first and foremost, of course, the Chinese defense minister, strongly suggests a plan to gradually start developing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, if not exactly into a full-scale military alliance, into something that is starting to look rather like one. And note also the way in which he talks about how the Russian-led military alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, might establish some kind of legal relationship with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. One can see in these comments and in these exercises the exercise in Uzbekistan, the exercise in Tajikistan, this big exercise in North China, which is going to dwarf all the others. And in these discussions which have taken place in Dushanbe between the defense ministers, clear indications of the integration of Greater Eurasia, as the Russians like to call it, into not just an economic bloc, but a political military one, challenging the Western alliance of the United States, led by the United States. It's all at the moment still mainly at the level of discussion and planning, but the planning is now moving into a very high level. The troops of the various countries are all training together, and the organizational structures are starting to be created. So we are starting to look at what is increasingly looking like the emergence of a very interesting and potentially very powerful overt Eurasian bloc in rivalry to that of the Western Alliance. And what makes this very interesting, and perhaps it is not a coincidence, is that this has come alongside a fascinating interview given by a well-known Russian international affairs analyst, Sergei Karaganov, to Argumenti I Fakti, which is a semi-official Russian newspaper, one which is often used by senior Russian officials to highlight ideas that the Russian government has about the ways forward. Now, I should say that Karaganov is an academic and a scholar, but he is also known to be very close to Putin. He has been an advisor to Putin for many years, and he is currently the head of the World Economy and International Affairs faculty at the Higher School of Economics, which is one of the most prestigious universities, not just in Moscow, but in Russia itself. And he is also someone who is said to have come up with something called the Karaganov Doctrine, which says that Russia should act as the defender of the human rights of ethnic Russians living in the near abroad, the territories of the former Soviet Union. Now, Karaganov is known to be an enthusiast for the relationship between China and Russia, the strategic partnership between China and Russia. And this interview, which, as I said, seems to be coinciding rather interestingly with all these exercises that are taking place and with all these discussions that were taking place in Dushanbe, and which will no doubt be pursued further when Shoigu arrives in China and meets with the Chinese Defense Ministry officials over the course of this forthcoming exercise. Anyway, Karaganov has much to say about this, and it all seems to be intended to develop and express and articulate the idea of the setting up of this bloc. And I'm going to read excerpts of the things that Karaganov said, and also summaries which have been published by RT on its website, taking it from the original Argumenti I Fakti interview, which is, of course, in Russian. And we read things like this. And this is a comment by Karaganov. He talks about the high prospect that whilst the Soviet Union might have lost the first Cold War, Russia is ahead at in the rematch with the US, and this time has every chance of coming out on top. And he's quoted as saying, "There are several factors that allow us to talk about good chances for success. Firstly, he makes the point that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was concerned with enemies on more than one front. It had to deal with China in the east and with the United States and its allies in the west. Now, China is a strategic partner and, as Karaganov says, a strategic resource. And he also makes the point that Russia itself is much more prosperous than it was during the later years of the Soviet Union. He then goes on to say the following, and it's quite interesting. In order to win against the weakening but still powerful West, we need to pursue the right policies both at home and abroad. And that means not taking on the burdens that the Soviet Union was carrying, which he describes perhaps somewhat melodramatically as the USSR feeding half the world, even whilst it was experiencing food shortages. He points out that today, Russia, unlike the Soviet Union, does not have a whole cluster of dependent client states and is therefore able to develop its own economy and resources without carrying all those sort of burdens. And he makes some rather telling points about some of the former Soviet republics. He says Georgia received the most money per capita in the USSR, and Ukraine received the most money in absolute terms. It is no coincidence that with the loss of these subsidies, all of them became dramatically poorer. And then he mainly talks about China. He says when it comes to China, he refers to the relationship as a semi-alliance, noting that it came about due to the West's geostrategic failures. However, the political scientist warned against selling the country's sovereignty to Beijing, repeating the mistakes of Europe's close friendship with Washington in the past. And knowing Russian history and the psychology of our people and political class, I think that we will not sell our sovereignty to anyone. And I hope for the wisdom of the Chinese political class, if I were Chinese, I would never do anything against China. And he also talks about the fact that Russia has other friends, some in the Arab countries, Iran, India, and even some European Union states such as Hungary and Austria. And he says we are seeing a watershed. We will find out who will be part of Greater America, like the US and Northwest Europe, and who will be on the side of Greater Eurasia. And the big question is where Germany will end up. Now, one doesn't have to go along with all of the things that Karaganov said. As I said, he's an academic. He's got his own ideas about things. He is close to Putin. But we see talk now increasingly and increasingly made public in places like Russia about the need to develop a greater Eurasia. Now, this will not be the kind of centralized bloc that the United States and the West have become, in which Washington has become essentially the major pole in which all the major decisions are made. It will rather be a partnership between states which, if not perhaps exactly equal with each other, will nonetheless be much more equal than the Western alliance will be. But perhaps that will make it more resilient. Anyway, what we are seeing, and it's now, I think, becoming a trend, which is starting to look as if it's irreversible, is a further concerted consolidation of Greater Eurasia as a political military bloc, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization set up by China and Russia becoming increasingly the legal foundation and perhaps the center. And we will see how this works out, we may very well find a Euro-Atlantic bloc which brings together NATO and the European Union facing off against a Eurasian bloc built around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but with other structures like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and of course the Eurasian Economic Community, all integrating together within it. I think that this division into two blocks is now, as I said, irreversible. And we are indeed, it seems to me, in the early stages of a second Cold War, though unlike Karaganov, I think it is too early to say, far too early to say, who is going to win it. Though it must also be said that this time the two sides are far more evenly matched than they were during the First Cold War, when the economic power of the United States and its allies far exceeded that of the Soviet Union and its allies. This time, arguably, it is China and Russia together that perhaps have the greater resources. But we shall see. As for what role Germany will play in all of this, I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think Karaganov is being far too optimistic, but that's a question, Germany's role, which I intend to discuss one day in a different program. Well, thank you for joining me in this program today. We will see how Greater Eurasia evolves. If it does, we will see where the Russian-Chinese partnership is going. We will see whether the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will indeed acquire this extra military dimension. But certainly the trajectory of travel seems to point that way. Thank you very much for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. Please also check us out on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also go to our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, and Locals. Now, we have high plans for what we're going to do with Locals, and please, therefore, sign into that channel and prepare for yourself for all the extraordinary and amazing things that are to come. As Alex Christoforou, my colleague, said on our recent live stream that we did on the Duran, I've gradually been assembling a whole fascinating array of equipment, all of which is intended to be used in part to develop what we're going to do on Locals, on that platform. And Alex, by the way, has been doing the same. So please keep an eye on what we're going to be doing there. And of course, if you want to support us in our various endeavors, well, you can do so via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And please also don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things you will find there, our wonderful Duran Magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me today on this program. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to tick the like button. Please also check your subscription to this channel. And I look forward to you joining me again. And have a wonderful day.